Imagine you're cleaning your house. You grab a broom, you start sweeping the floor, but instead of sweeping the dust and dirt out the front door like you normally would, you very deliberately sweep it all into a neat little pile right in the dead center of the room.
Right, which sounds completely counterintuitive to anyone who has ever tried to actually maintain a house.
Exactly.
I mean, the standard logic is always to push the mess outward, away from your living space, right?
Yeah, it goes against all basic cleaning logic, but you do it because, well, your parents did it and their parents did it before them. You just assume it's like a quirky family habit, maybe some strange old superstition about not sweeping your luck out the door or something.
Right, it just becomes invisible to you because it is so deeply normalized within your own four walls, you don't even question it.
But what if I told you that this highly specific way of sweeping the floor isn't just a quirky chore? What if it's actually a centuries-old survival tactic, like a hidden historical footprint left behind by people terrified of the Inquisition just trying to avoid being caught practicing their religion?
It is wild when you really look at it.
It is. And today, for this deep dive, we are taking a stack of research. We're specifically leaning into the text Echoes of Sefarad, Jewish Legacy in the Dominican Republic, to completely upend how you think about Caribbean history.
Absolutely.
Our mission today is to prove that history isn't just trapped in, dry academic textbooks. It's hiding in plain sight. It's in our everyday culture. It's in the food on our plates. And yeah, in family traditions that people practice without even knowing why.
And tracing these invisible threads, I mean, it makes the map of the world look incredibly different. You start to see how human migration and survival and economics, how they all just weave together to create the cultures we completely take for granted today.
Right, because if you know anything about Jewish history in the Caribbean, or specifically the Dominican Republic, your mind probably jumps straight to a very specific era.
The 20th century.
Exactly, the mid-20th century. You think of World War II, refugees fleeing the horrors of Europe, finding this safe haven on a tropical island. And I mean, that is a massive, important part of the story, which we will absolutely get to. But that is actually Act 2.
Yeah, looking only at the 20th century it's like walking into a complex movie halfway through. You see the action, but you miss the entire foundational setup.
Right, you miss the prequel. The story actually begins centuries earlier, and it completely reframes the economic and cultural map of the entire region. So we're not starting in the 1930s. We're going way back to the era of sail and empire. And we are starting with the Sephardic Jews.
Which we should probably establish exactly who we are talking about here.
Yeah, good call.
When we say Sephardic Jews, we are tracing roots back to the Iberian Peninsula, so modern-day Spain and Portugal. And the defining trauma of this community, the catastrophic event that scattered them across the globe, was the Inquisition. You had this entire population that was suddenly forced by the crown to either convert to Catholicism, leave their homeland entirely, or face execution.
Which is just an unimaginable choice.
Truly. And many who managed to escape ended up navigating across the Atlantic, seeking places where they could rebuild.
Yeah.
So by the time we get to the 1700s and early 1800s, a highly successful, established Sephardic community had planted itself firmly under Dutch colonial rule in Curaçao.
And Curaçao is fascinating here because if we look at the map of Caribbean commerce at that time, it was essentially, well, the ultimate clearinghouse.
Oh, absolutely. Curaçao had the deep water ports, and they had the sophisticated Dutch banking infrastructure that just made it the absolute center of gravity for regional trade.
Right, because of the Dutch connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you wanted to move massive quantities of sugar, tobacco, manufactured goods, or if you just wanted access to international credit markets in the Caribbean, the money and the ships flowed through Curaçao. But, economies are living, breathing mechanisms. They expand, and eventually they contract.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where the migration to the Dominican Republic actually happens. You have this thriving commercial hub in Curaçao. But by the early 19th century, the economic tides start shifting. The text we're looking at notes a downturn. So you have all these young, highly ambitious Sephardic merchants sitting in Curaçao, and they start looking at their own market and realizing the ceiling is getting a bit too low for them.
Yeah, the local market was becoming saturated, and political shifts in the region were making trade a lot more volatile. They basically needed room to grow.
I picture 19th century Curaçao almost like, I don't know, a modern tech startup incubator.
Oh, that's actually a pretty good way to look at it.
Right. You have all this localized talent, all this concentrated capital, and massive ambition. But eventually, a startup incubator gets too crowded. The The local market gets saturated. So what do the young, hungry entrepreneurs do? They spin out.
They look for emerging markets.
Exactly. They look for untapped, developing markets where their specific skill sets can dominate. And for these Sephardic merchants, that next big emerging market was the shores of Hispaniola, specifically the Dominican Republic.
And they didn't just bring physical goods to sell when they made that jump. I think
Yeah.
it is so easy to think of historical migration purely in terms of, bodies moving from point A to point B.
Right, just packing up suitcases.
Right. But they brought an entire invisible infrastructure with them. They brought highly sophisticated international trading networks that span all the way back across the Atlantic to
But when they arrive in Santo Domingo, the capital, the way they integrate is honestly not what you would expect.
No, not at all.
Usually, when you have an influx of a new, economically powerful religious or cultural group, you see grand public architecture popping up. You would expect to see, like, massive synagogues built in the center of the city to declare their arrival and their status, but you don't find that.
And the reason for that absence is deeply tied to the historical trauma of the Inquisition. You have to remember their long history with crypto-Judaism.
Which is the practice of maintaining your religion in absolute secret.
Right. For generations, during and after the Inquisition, the only way these families survived was to publicly assimilate into the dominant Catholic culture while privately, very quietly, maintaining their Jewish faith behind closed doors.
Just constantly looking over their shoulders.
Exactly. So even centuries later, when they arrive in the Dominican Republic, which was a heavily Catholic country, the ingrained multi-generational instinct isn't to build a giant, highly visible monument to their distinct religion. The religious practice was kept intentionally quiet, almost invisible to the wider public.
Their religion was invisible, but their economic impact was completely undeniable. They essentially revitalized the maritime trade in the capital. And, even though they didn't build grand religious monuments, they did leave subtle physical proof behind if you know where to look.
Yeah, the old city cemetery.
Yes. Our sources point out something incredibly poignant. If you walk into the Old City Cemetery in Santo Domingo, there's a very specific tombstone dating back to 1826. It belongs to a man named Jacob Pardo. He was a Sephardic Jew from Amsterdam who came through that Curaçao pipeline, and there he rests in Dominican soil.
It is just a single stone, but mechanically it functions as an anchor point. It provides hard, physical proof of this entire demographic and economic shift from the old world through the Caribbean incubator directly into the heart of Santo Domingo.
So they establish themselves in the capital, they get the economy humming, but they don't just stay in Santo Domingo. The nature of expanding wealth pushes these families to look outward.
Right, into the provinces.
Which brings us to the southern provinces, specifically areas like Baní and San Cristóbal. And this is the moment in the deep dive where the story shifts from just being about ledgers and international trade to being about deep structural cultural integration.
The transformation of the South is a perfect study in applied economics. Let's look at Baní. Historically, Baní is known today for having a very distinct, highly entrepreneurial commercial culture. And according to the texts we are analyzing, a massive part of that specific commercial DNA stems directly from these Sephardic families who settled there in the 19th century and applied their global networks to local agriculture.
They turned it into an agricultural powerhouse. In San Cristóbal, it was the same playbook. They utilized their access to international capital to establish massive cattle ranches and highly productive sugar estates.
But crucially, the texts show this wasn't purely extractive. They weren't just colonial entities taking wealth out of the region and sending it back to Europe. Because their wealth was tied to the land, they were strongly incentivized to develop the surrounding areas.
They had skin in the game.
Exactly. Their global commerce ties ended up funding early civic projects. They financed the building of roads to move their goods, which obviously benefited everyone. They funded local schools. They were essentially acting as early infrastructure developers for the Dominican provinces.
But I want to talk about how they integrated socially. Because we established that they kept their religion quiet. But if they were this wealthy and influential, how did they protect that wealth without holding the formal political power of the local Dominican elites?
What's fascinating here is the social mechanism they used, which historians refer to as fusion. Yeah, you have this immigrant community that is economically very powerful, but demographically quite small. Furthermore, because they kept things quiet, they lacked formal religious institutions, they didn't have established synagogues in these southern provinces, and they didn't have formal rabbis to enforce strict religious boundaries or community separation.
So without that strict separation, they had to build alliances.
They formed strategic alliances through marriage. These Sephardic merchants simply intermarried with prominent land-owning Dominican Catholic families. It was a mutual exchange of power.
Wow, so they just fully blended in.
Right. The Sephardic families gained local political protection and deep social roots, and the Dominican families gained access to international wealth and global markets. Over generations of these strategic marriages, the distinct religious boundary just dissolved into the broader regional culture.
And that makes the cultural memory aspect of this so mind-blowing to me. When religion dissolves but the physical habits remain, you get these incredible echoes. The sources detail how descendants in Baní today are keeping old Jewish traditions alive, but it is completely divorced from the concept of Judaism in their own minds.
Yeah, they practice these rituals simply as, what our family has always done.
It's just family tradition.
Exactly. The historical text documents families in Baní who meticulously light candles, specifically on Friday nights, which mirrors the start of the Jewish Sabbath. They honor incredibly strict mourning customs involving covering mirrors in the house, which directly aligns with Jewish traditions of sitting Shiva.
And this brings us all the way back to the broom from our intro, the sweeping.
Yes, sweeping the dirt through the center of the room rather than out the door was a literal survival tactic from the days of the Inquisition.
Because if you swept it out the front door,
If you swept the dirt out your front door on a Friday afternoon, it could be a signal to an informant or a neighbor or the authorities that you were preparing your home for the Sabbath. It was a visual tell that could get you killed. So women learned to sweep inward to hide their observance.
it is staggering. Centuries later, thousands of miles away in a sunny Dominican province, a family is still sweeping inward. They are acting out a 500-year-old defense mechanism, completely unaware of the original terror that created the habit. It is permanently baked into their cultural DNA.
And that fused DNA profoundly shaped the highest levels of the nation. We are not just talking about interesting folklore in the provinces. If we look at the historical figures who sprang from this exact Sephardic Dominican lineage in the South, the impact is structural.
Yeah, they were major players.
We have towering political figures who govern the country, like President Francisco Enriquez y Carvajal. You have legendary literary and intellectual giants who defined the nation's culture, like Pedro Enriquez Ureña.
The people who literally wrote the story of the Dominican Republic came out of this invisible fusion. So for centuries, the Jewish experience in the Dominican Republic was defined by this quiet, almost undetectable assimilation. But the landscape of Dominican Jewry is about to experience a massive, sudden shock to the system.
In the 20th century.
Right, the deep dive moves to the 20th century, where we see a completely different wave of migration. And this one isn't a quiet arrival of merchants. It is a highly public, deeply politicized refugee crisis.
So here we transition from the Sephardic history to the Ashkenazi history. And just to be clear on the terms, Ashkenazi refers to Jews of Central and Eastern European descent, possessing a completely different cultural and geographic background than the Iberian Sephardic Jews.
Right.
To understand their arrival, we really have to look at the tense geopolitical reality of 1938.
1938 is the year of the Évian Conference. The situation in Europe is becoming catastrophic for Jewish citizens under the aggressive rise of Nazi Germany. 32 nations gather in France at the urging of the U.S. to discuss what to do about the rapidly growing number of Jewish refugees.
Then it was a failure.
A devastating failure. Basically, the entire international community turns its back. Country after country stands up, cites economic depression or domestic politics, and says their quotas are full. But then the Dominican Republic steps up. Specifically, the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. He publicly offers to take in up to 100,000 Jewish refugees.
And on paper, to a casual observer, it sounds like an incredibly heroic humanitarian gesture in a dark time.
But here's where it gets really interesting. When you read the source material detailing Trujillo's actual motivations, the heroism vanishes. And to be completely clear to you listening, we are just looking impartially at what the historical texts outline here. We aren't injecting modern politics, just reporting the facts as the sources document them. And the texts explicitly show that Trujillo's offer was absolutely not born out of humanitarian altruism.
Not at all. It was a highly calculated geopolitical maneuver born out of a horrific domestic atrocity. Just 1 year prior, in 1937, Trujillo had ordered what is known as the Parsley Massacre.
It was just brutal.
It was the systematic, military-led murder of thousands of Haitians and Dominicans of Haitian descent living along the border. It was an absolute bloodbath, and it caused massive international outrage. Trujillo's reputation on the global stage, especially in Washington, was completely toxic.
Wait, I'm confused here. If Trujillo just committed a massive racially motivated massacre against Haitians, how does bringing in European refugees suddenly make the international community, or U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, overlook that? How does that political math work?
Well, it's about optics and leverage, right? By offering to solve a refugee crisis that the United States and Europe desperately wanted to ignore, Trujillo positioned himself as a necessary ally.
Oh, I see.
Offering to take in Jewish refugees when the rest of the world was turning them away was a transactional way to force foreign powers to deal with him, essentially attempting to wipe his slate clean diplomatically.
So it was leverage.
Exactly. But Trujillo's PR campaign was only half the story. The sources explicitly detail a much darker internal motivation for wanting European bodies on his island.
You are talking about his domestic racial agenda.
The sources are unequivocal on this. Trujillo had a stated discriminatory political agenda to whiten the Dominican population. He viewed the influx of European refugees, regardless of their religion, honestly, not as human beings needing rescue from totalitarianism, but as a demographic tool. He wanted to alter the racial makeup of his country, specifically to distance it further from its African and Haitian roots.
Which is just so profoundly disturbing to read about.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it presents one of the most profound, unsettling paradoxes you will ever find in history. You have a genuine lifeline being thrown to European refugees, people who desperately needed saving from the impending Holocaust, and that lifeline is inextricably tied to a domestic tragedy and a deeply racist political agenda.
The geopolitics of rescue are incredibly messy. But regardless of Trujillo's dark motivations, the offer was made and the door was opened. And this complex maneuver directly resulted in the creation of a brand new, highly visible community on the northern coast. Let's look at the reality of Sosúa.
So Trujillo offered to take 100,000, but the reality of wartime logistics, massive bureaucratic hurdles, and the eventual closing of European borders meant that nowhere near that number could actually escape.
Right. It was just physically impossible.
Ultimately, roughly 700 to 800 Ashkenazi Jews from Germany, Austria, and Eastern Europe actually managed to make the arduous journey to the Dominican Republic.
Just put yourself in their shoes for a moment. You're a doctor in Berlin. You're a lawyer in Vienna. You're an artist, a musician, a university professor. You are a cosmopolitan urbanite who has just escaped a collapsing Europe. You cross the ocean, you arrive in the Dominican Republic, and the government doesn't set you up in a modern apartment in the capital city of Santo Domingo.
No, they send this group of European professionals directly to the northern coast.
They drop you in Sosúa. At the time, Sosúa was not the developed beach town it is today. It was essentially raw jungle and an abandoned, overgrown banana plantation.
Imagine the culture shock.
Exactly. Imagine stepping off a boat in your heavy wool European clothing, stepping into the absolute sweltering humidity of the Caribbean jungle, and someone hands you a machete and a cow and says, "Good luck, figure out dairy farming."
The physical and psychological shock must have been overwhelming. You have people dealing with profound survivor's guilt, navigating a completely alien climate, facing tropical diseases like malaria, and trying to learn agriculture in soil they just fundamentally don't understand.
How did they actually do it? I mean, how do you go from being a lawyer in Vienna to running a tropical farm?
They had to rely on fierce community organization and intense collaboration. The texts detail how they pooled their resources. They couldn't survive individually, so they formed a collective. Furthermore, they had to collaborate with local Dominican farmhands who actually understood the climate, the land, and the livestock.
Right. They couldn't just read a book on European farming. They needed local expertise.
Exactly. By combining European organizational techniques with local Dominican agricultural knowledge, they managed to adapt.
And they took this raw, unforgiving land and established a highly organized dairy and meat cooperative. They called it Productos Sosúa. What is truly amazing to me is that they built it with such efficiency and resilience that Productos Sosúa remarkably still exists today. It became an absolute cornerstone of the national dairy industry, feeding the entire country.
They transitioned from being traumatized refugees to being the agricultural kings of the northern coast.
Yeah.
Which, brings into focus the grand contrast of this entire history.
Yeah.
When you look at the Dominican Republic through this lens, you see two completely different Jewish experiences that shaped the nation in entirely different ways.
It is like looking at a historical split screen.
It really is. In the south, in places like Baní and San Cristóbal, you have the Sephardic history. It's older, stretching back centuries. It's rooted in Caribbean commerce, the Curaçao pipeline, and strategic intermarriage. It's characterized by invisible fusion.
Right.
It quietly blended into the cultural and merchant identity of the Dominican people until the specific religious origins were almost completely forgotten by the descendants themselves.
The hidden history, the swept floors and the lit candles.
Yeah. Then on the other side of the screen, in the north, in Sosúa, you have the Ashkenazi history.
Yeah.
It's much more recent, born out of the highly visible trauma of World War II and the complex transactional politics of 1938.
Right, the Trujillo era.
Unlike the South, this community remained largely distinct. They built a visible, institutionalized pocket of European Jewish life in the Caribbean. They built a synagogue, they maintained their specific cultural identity, and they built a massive agricultural empire from scratch.
Two totally different waves of migration, two different geographic regions of the country, two entirely different survival mechanisms, yet both of them left a massive, undeniable, permanent mark on the structural DNA of the Dominican Republic.
It's incredible.
So what does this all mean for you? Why does unpacking this specific history matter to someone listening today?
I think it matters because it proves that history is never just locked away in an archive. It is quite literally on your plate.
Whether you are walking through the vibrant streets of Baní and sampling their famous local sweets, or you are at a supermarket grabbing a block of Sosúa cheese for your kitchen, you aren't just eating food. You are literally tasting centuries of complex human migration, of terror and escape, of strange geopolitical alliances, and of incredible human resilience.
The past is always echoing into the present, often in ways we don't even realize. I mean, we've seen today how monumental historical events, like the Spanish Inquisition forcing people to flee for their lives across an ocean, ended up dictating how people hide their identities in the most mundane, everyday chores.
Like sweeping.
Like the simple act of sweeping the dirt to the center of a room. A habit passed down for hundreds of years, long after the original meaning, the original fear, was completely forgotten by the people doing the sweeping. It raises a fascinating question, something for you to think about long after this deep dive ends.
What's that?
What quirky, unexplained habits or traditions exist in your own family today? And what forgotten historical survival story might they be secretly telling?